Again, welcome back to Poli-Sci 110. This lecture focuses on trends in federalism, both historic and modern day trends as well. So I will give you a very brief overview of some terms from the textbook, and then I will introduce a new concept known as bottom-up federalism. Let's get started. The relationship between the federal and the state governments has changed over time in terms of power sharing. At different points in time, the federal government has been less powerful and the states have been more powerful. If we look at a historical trajectory, for example, federal power tended to grow in several stages throughout American history. These stages are classified by scholars according to several names. In particular, the first stage, beginning with the establishment of the federal government with the Constitutional Convention and ratification of the Constitution in 1787 and into 1788, this helped to establish the national order. During this time, the federal government was quite weak and different political parties emerged in order to debate the merits of a stronger federal government. This is where some of the arguments between Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and others emerged during the administration of George Washington, some of which you might recall are part of the musical Hamilton. But by the 1860s, however, and in particular with the American Civil War, the federal government had acquired new power, and those powers were different from the state powers. And so scholars often classify this time as a period of dual federalism in which the federal and the state governments exercised powers separately. By the time of the Great Depression and the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s, the federal government had amassed more power and it began to encroach on some of the traditional functions of the states. This increase in federal power came about due to various pieces of legislation designed to combat economic depression. And this new period marks a shift towards cooperative federalism, in which state officials work more closely with the federal government to implement federal programs. By the 1970s, however, under various presidents, particularly Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, the federal government began to allocate more power or devolve more authority back to the state governments. This more recent period is known as the new federalism or devolved federalism. The states now have acquired more authority over implementing federal policies than what they once had. The federal government is more powerful, certainly, than at the beginning of the Republic in the 1780s, and the states have began to implement a lot of those policies in the current time. This includes receiving money from the federal government to implement programs like Medicaid or Medicare. So our federal government began quite weak. Two political parties began to form, as I mentioned earlier, largely because of these arguments over how strong the federal government should be over the states. People like Alexander Hamilton wanted a stronger national government and formed the Federalist Party. Alexander Hamilton had also favored a stronger executive or president during the Constitutional Convention, where he was a delegate. People like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, both of Virginia, wanted a weaker federal government. They wanted to preserve the various rights or powers of the states at this time, and they formed a party known as the Democratic Republican Party. This idea of the right trade-off between federal and state power was one of the biggest issues during the administration of George Washington. Ultimately, however, the Supreme Court did delegate more powers to the federal government until the 1830s or so, including the right to form a national bank and regulate interstate steamboats. it took some time for the Supreme Court to expand the powers of the federal government, even though various provisions within the Constitution allowed for interstate commerce to be regulated by the federal government. It took time for the court to recognize how exactly those constitutional provisions might be carried out or enforced in reality. There were crises along the way. South Carolina, for example, threatened to secede from the Union as early as the 1830s because it objected to a tariff act that it felt harmed the state's economy disproportionately. This sparked what's known as a nullification crisis, in which South Carolina's government said that it would not enforce the new tariff. However, the federal government under Andrew Jackson overcame this and ultimately pressured the state to enforce the Tariff Act. And there was a compromise in Congress where the tariff was lowered in part. To give you a better idea of these more recent stages of dual federalism and cooperative federalism, recall that dual federalism emerged with the Civil War. Dual federalism can be imagined as a layer cake where the states and the federal government are each different layers of a cake, and they have different functions. So they're quite distinct entities. Programs and authority are clearly divided between the state, national, and local governments. However, with cooperative federalism, which emerged towards the New Deal and Great Depression, the functions between state and federal government began to merge. And so the layer cake became more of a marble cake. And if you've ever seen these cakes, you'll find that there are different colors or swirls throughout the marble cake. In other words, the different layers of government have become combined or enmeshed with each other over time. Today, under new or devolved federalism, what we've seen is that federal administrations have shifted power back to the states, particularly beginning with Richard Nixon's administration. Ronald Reagan, president in the 1980s, transitioned the federal government from categorical grants to block grants. What this means is that the federal government began to give money to the states with fewer strings attached. Whereas categorical grants had to be used for specific purposes, block grants could be used without those specific purposes. In other words, block grants could be used for a wide variety of purposes that the states saw fit. President Clinton in the 1990s limited unfunded mandates as well. Unfunded mandates occur whenever the Congress and the president require, that is, they pass a law and the president signs the law, that requires that various states implement a policy, but the Congress does not provide money for implementing that policy. An example of an unfunded mandate occurred in the early 2000s when the No Child Left Behind Act requires standardized testing of K through 12 or maybe 4th grade through 12th grade students throughout the 50 states, but did not really provide funding for implementing those tests, or not a lot of funding. So different standards emerged, different tests emerged across the states. And recent Supreme Court cases have devolved more federal power to the states as well. So the fact that President Clinton limited unfunded mandates allowed the states some breathing room, or it no longer subjected them to having to make policies on behalf of the federal government and having to finance those policies as well. And so since the 1970s, the big picture is the states have acquired more power relative to what they used to have in regards to the federal government. We do see to this present day that states differ in terms of how much money they receive from the federal government. States such as New York, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina, towards the top of this chart, receive a lot more money from the federal government relative to what their taxpayers paid. States like New Jersey, Illinois, or Minnesota receive actually less money per person from the federal government than what their taxpayers pay. You might be wondering what explains these differences. Part of the difference is that some states receive a lot more money for infrastructure spending, like New York, and some states, particularly poorer states, receive more money for programs such as Medicaid, for example. But another trend as well is that for states that are smaller, that have 2 senators within the United States Senate, they tend to get more money per person as well. They have greater proportional voting power within the Senate, where every state is represented equally. And so recall the Connecticut Compromise from the Constitutional Convention. The compromise was simply that the House of Representatives would be apportioned based on population. Large states would have more representatives. The Senate would be apportioned based on equal representation of the states. Therefore, there are 2 senators from every state elected to the Senate. As a result, to the present day, smaller states with equal representation in the Senate tend to receive more dollars on a per voter basis than larger states that have just as much representation within the Senate. There are 2 senators per state, regardless of the population. And today as well, people tend to trust their local and state governments more than the national government. Trust in the national government really eroded around the 1960s and 1970s due to a number of factors, but the war in Vietnam and the Watergate scandal were leading causes. But throughout this entire time period and until the present day, approval ratings or ratings of trust have been higher consistently for local and state governments. There has been this resurgence of state government over time. And consistently, governors across the country have received higher approval ratings for their handling of COVID-19 than the President Trump, or in many cases, President Biden as well. A more recent trend within federalism marks this buildup of state power that we have seen. And this is a term that can be applied to a much newer set of policies. This is called bottom-up federalism. Bottom-up federalism occurs whenever enough states make a policy that the federal government has to act in a different way, or ultimately somehow the federal policy also changes as well. Starting in the mid-2000s, a number of states began to legalize medicinal marijuana use. To this day now, many states have legalized recreational marijuana use as well within certain limits. So many states began to deregulate or to allow the use of marijuana within limits that by 2013, the Obama administration instructed the Department of Justice not to prosecute marijuana-related crimes. And this, some say, opened the door for more states to legalize either medicinal or recreational use of marijuana. And so this is an example where enough states actually legalized marijuana that the Department of Justice changed its own policy. Another example of bottom-up federalism is related to same-sex marriage. In 2004, Massachusetts became the first state to allow same-sex marriage. And with every year, more states began to allow same-sex marriage as well. By 2014, around half, maybe more than half, looking at the chart here, of states allow same-sex marriage. These differences in policy between states ultimately led to a court case known as Obergefell that made its way to the US Supreme Court in 2015. And as a result of that case, or in response to that case, the court ruled that these different marriage policies between states violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment in the Constitution. And so as a result, same-sex marriage is recognized across all 50 states. This is a second example of bottom-up federalism. We will continue our unit on federalism by discussing some major issues or controversies that arise in our federal system.